Hello, and welcome to Coffee Time. Coffee Time is a space where magical humans come together for some real talk, strong coffee, and powerful introspections on whatever is top of mind right now. My name is Natalie, and I am your host for this channel and today's super exciting conversation. The idea behind Coffee Time is that you are in your favorite coffee shop, maybe cozied up with a book, and you begin to listen in on an intriguing conversation between folks at the next table over. For that reason, there is no big introduction. We absolutely let the conversation speak for itself. And if you do want to know more about these special guests following today's episode, I invite you to check out the show notes for more details. So, on that note, let's dive right in. Hello.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am good. I think we're all set. Things are a little bit different where you are, but we've all still dealt with this pandemic and are dealing with this pandemic. And there has been, though, as you mentioned, a lot happening. And I've noticed like the day to day is kind of stagnant because like I'm working from home. Now I go out a little bit more. Not that it's gotten better here, but I think because people seem to more consistently be taking it seriously and there's a lot more precautions put in place across the board. So like I feel more okay going to the store than I did at the very beginning when it was just all over the place. But in like personal life and like for me, my spiritual growth, things have been, like you say, moving so fast. And that's actually, you just naturally created such a good segue because that's been the most recent thing was, I think over the last couple months, I've been going through a lot of like spiritual growth, etc. And then that kind of led into, not directly tied to, but led into an uncoupling with my twin flame. So I have been processing that for the last month and a half. And like, that's a huge life shift. And I know you had talked before about like, going through uncoupling, and I really like the wording you use, and I would love for you to expand on it, like not letting it define you, because I think that's really powerful, but it can mean different things for different people.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that that's happened
Thank you.
for you, because I can't imagine that must be easy, because you were together for a while, weren't you?
Yeah, for 4.5 years. We actually got engaged last November, and the uncoupling kind of happened. I don't know the best wording to use. Like I said, it's very fresh, so I'll share what feels okay, but there's a lot. In August, which is when originally we had actually planned our wedding, but then due to COVID, we had to cancel that because we were long distance. And so the border, actually until this week, oddly enough, the international border had been closed. So we couldn't even see each other. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think it's the difficult thing about when a relationship breaks down is, like I was saying to you before, how you instantly start to feel like everything is your fault and how could you be better and how could you be different and what could you have done or said at a particular time to change the turn of events and for this not to have happened. But it's just so crucial to not let that define you, because once you start blaming yourself for everything, you sort of lose sight that it was two people that were tangling, like you weren't tangling on your own. Sometimes you are, but but yeah, it's so easy to do that. And I think what made it so easy for me to not do it this time around was because I had been through it before. It's just one of those things where experience was my teacher. You know, I went through so long of dating guys, and it always ended up being them that ended the relationship, and I didn't want that to happen. So I'd always be like, why was it me? But then sort of reflecting and like, well, I got over that guy and I was fine and I was still, you know, my great self, and I just moved on to the next person. But it's just hard when it's so fresh to not let those feelings and emotions take over you so completely, because it's hard when your feelings are invested. It's one of the most difficult things. I mean, a Brazilian wax is easier.
They're not as bad as people seem to think. Like, I'm just going to throw that out there. People are so
Um,
terrified of those waxes. And I mean, not that it's the most pleasant experience, but
no, it's
I mean, I
not.
take that any day comparatively. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, that's a good analogy. I like it.
Yeah. So is that something you feel you've been struggling with a little bit since it's happened?
Honestly, yeah, that I think that's really important that you mentioned that, because that has been a big thing that has come up for me that's now led to a lot of other work to do, but definitely those feelings of basically replaying in my head every single little thing I did wrong or like could have done differently. And I think for me, that was actually a realization I had had a couple weeks before this decision was made. And so I was very much in a place of having recognized those things, at least to an extent, and been
Mhm.
like, okay, I need to change this. And then this happened. Oh, my cat just came to say hello. Um, here he is. Say hi.
Hi.
Um, but I think that, and maybe you've experienced this too, like even I think day to day in relationships, you notice things, right? Like you pick up on when you're tired and you're not being as patient as you could be. And that was a huge one for me because I realize now I like way overworked myself for the last 2 years,
Yeah.
things like that. But definitely, I think when officially the relationship was ended, and I still don't know the best words to use because I say relationship ended, but like we both know we'll have a relationship ongoing. It just looks different than the romantic partnership that we were in.
Yeah.
But I think when that happened, it definitely hit on a next level. And like for me, a lot of those thoughts of like, this was my fault, what did I do, etc., are pointing back to some really deep personal work that I need to do. And a lot of truly like unprocessed trauma from the last 29 years that I didn't realize I hadn't felt my way through. Um, but someone said something to me that was really interesting when I was really like deep in those thoughts that you're talking about of like, what did I do? This is all my fault, blah, blah, blah. And she was like,
Mhm.
what did she say? Maybe you never really had the control to make a mistake anyway. Cause I kept saying that I messed up. Like I did all these things. And I think her point there was similar to what you're saying of like, it takes two to tango. Like it's not just me. Um, but also like I think in a relationship, and especially if you're like me and you default at least at times to being more like
Yeah.
anxious attachment, um, there's that feeling of like if I do a certain thing, this surely will be the result. But that's really never the case because like we're all human, we're all fallible, we're all
Mhm.
sporadic on occasion. And I
Yeah.
think there's that sense of control and making mistakes. Like it helps me feel that exactly that. Like if I can blame myself, I have control over what happened. It's not totally that other person's decision. But the
Mhm.
fact of the matter is, I never had that control to begin with. And that's part of being in a relationship and being vulnerable and trusting, even though everything could fall apart.
Yeah. Yeah. Trust is a huge thing because I think without that, you can't really be in a relationship at all. Otherwise you'll spend every day over analyzing what the person is. Oh, sorry, that's the chair.
That's okay.
Over analyzing what the other person is doing and reading too much into their messages. When at the end of the day, and this is my word for 2020, is it's all about trust. Well, trust because we've just spoken about that, but boundaries. Boundaries is just the most important thing anyone could ever learn, not just for romantic relationships, but working relationships, friendships, family relationships too, because I feel without having healthy boundaries in place, you can't have a healthy relationship either. And part of those boundaries is also working on building trust because when you don't have trust, that's when you're more likely yourself to cross a line, to cross the boundary in an unhealthy way, where maybe that's when you'll start checking their phone or trying to get into their laptop, or, even though you're together, stalking their social media a little bit too much. And it's just those really unhealthy behaviors that I think a lot of people take on themselves without realizing as well. And that's something that I didn't necessarily do, um, because I think from speaking to a counselor about it,
Mm-hmm.
I think I just was in this position where when I was back in Sydney, I didn't have the kind of social life that fulfilled me. So I was trying to find that in a relationship or in a guy. And so I would just want to do whatever I could to make it happen and make it work without setting those healthy boundaries. And often, lose myself in the process as well. And now that I'm living somewhere else and I have a wonderful, thriving social life, it's made it a lot easier for me to recognize that I don't need that person to complete me. They are more an enhancement of my life because I'm happy within me, and having them just makes my life 110% as opposed to 100%.
I love
So,
that. Yeah, I think that's actually something I've been recognizing because now, of course, I've been filling a bit more time with friends and connection as much as I can safely with the current situation. And even just
yeah,
talking to friends online who I maybe didn't talk to as much before, but I have been seeing more people in person. But something that I'm noticing that I think is just going to be something I learn as I go, because my partner would come up on weekends because of living in the States and we work during the week. And so we'd be together the whole weekend. And then I was working and still am 7 to 4 during the week and trying to build a business and all that stuff. And I am a hardcore introvert.
mhm,
So as much as I am someone who definitely is exactly what you're saying is like you need to have all these different nurturing relationships and not put all your eggs in one basket. Also out of
mhm,
fairness to that person because like they can't be there 110% for you all the time
mhm,
because they have their own shit, right? Like that's life.
yeah,
Um but also from being with a person, even though, of course, someone amazing who I wanted to invest my time with for 3 days straight, I was socially depleted at the end. And so I didn't have the personal resources to then
mhm,
really nurture those other relationships. Or if I did, I'd be depleted coming back into that one on the weekends. So
yeah.
I haven't quite figured that out, but I think it's definitely something I've noticed is it's going to be a bit of a learning for me to kind of create the balance you were talking about, I think, as I move forward, knowing that I need so much time, like
Yeah.
it's solitude.
Mhm.
But for now, just kind of noticing that and being aware of it so that exactly what you're saying, like the next time I enter into a relationship, I can keep those boundaries for myself and my energy in a way that works.
Yeah. No, that's so good that you noticed that because I'm the opposite. I'm extremely extroverted, but I still run out of steam.
Mhm.
And it was only last year that I realized that I'm not an infinite resource. As extroverted as I am, I also need time to recharge my batteries. I also don't want to be constantly messaging friends. I need time on my own, even if it's just one evening. So I probably wouldn't need as much as you might. But
Mhm.
even if I just dedicated a whole evening to just being by myself,
Mhm.
doing those kinds of things, I noticed was really helping me. And it's funny because before that, I never thought of myself as a resource, so to speak,
Yeah.
because I felt like I always, and I still do feel like I have so much to give people and the world around me. But when I reach a boiling point, it's not genuine, it's half hearted,
Mhm.
that maybe a slight twinge of resentment sometimes because I'm forcing myself into doing it.
Yeah.
So recognizing that is a really healthy thing, but it does take time and practice like anything. You don't learn how to drive a car the first time you sit in it. It takes a long time to learn how to drive a car properly and have the confidence to go out on the road on your own as well after that. And that's another thing. I think a lot of people, and myself included up until recently, we don't really realize that whether it's learning how to spend time with yourself more or doing some kind of personal growth privately on the side, It takes a long time. It's not, I'm not talking like I'm talking about 6 months, a year, years, like even years and years. And I think sometimes that can be quite daunting to think about, but you're better off being on that track and learning these skills, because you're only going to really learn them in practice as well. You know, how are you going to, if we go back to the boundaries, how are you going to learn to set boundaries if you don't actively practice that with people? So when it comes to dating, once you start putting yourself out there again, it's good to have in your head, you know, what will you stand for? What will you not stand for? Like, what are really key qualities in someone, or, you know, what are behaviors that you won't tolerate? And if that actually happens, don't, you know, give them the benefit of the doubt. Like, you just pick those, not everything, like those really core things.
Yeah.
You know? So like recently that happened with me, and it felt so nice to stick to that and not do what I would in the past of just been like, oh, that's okay, I'll just let it slide. And you're happy because then they get away with it and they sort of start coming back to you. But deep down inside, you know that you did a disservice to yourself, really, which is the unfortunate thing. So it is quite liberating when it happens, but doing it once is great. Making sure you do it every time, that's going to take practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's scary. Like, you know, because exactly what you said, it's like if you kind of appease that person or make an excuse for them or whatever. And I think circumstances can vary that sometimes, but within reason.
Yeah.
But doing that and they come back and it's like, oh, look, like we're more connected now because of this. But it's exactly like you say, like, I like that, doing a disservice to yourself. Because are you really more connected if you're not showing up as your whole authentic self?
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
really, because that's not the person connecting, right?
Yeah, you're being someone else, and then they get used to that version of you as well. And
Yep.
sometimes it's sad that, and I'm still learning. Every day is like a new learning for me in some aspect, but it's just as equally as nice when you decide, okay, even though I'm a little bit scared to say this answer or push back, I'm going to do it because that's what's more important to me. And then you find more often than not, the other person actually kind of respects you for it. And they can see you're someone that isn't so easily pushed around.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it just takes that courage to give it a go and see what happens, because even if it's not received well, I think at the end of the day, when you go to sleep, it's better to think, you know, I stood up for myself and what I believe in, rather than just caving to other people's wishes or being a type of person that they wanted me to be, not being myself. Yeah, so I mean, it's not easy, but courage definitely will get you further.
Mm-hmm. No, I like that. I think it's really powerful. And it's actually something you talked about, talking to a counselor. I was talking to my therapist on Friday, Saturday, I can't remember. And something that came up was that my cat's being silly. I have learned to equate conflict with rejection. And so, like when you say, like, there's the occasion where you will, you know, set that boundary and articulate what you're feeling, and the person will respect you more, and you actually might become more connected, which might feel counterintuitive. And that's something that I'm going to be, I guess, kind of retraining myself on, because currently I definitely, like, as soon as there is conflict, I move into that place of fear that I will be abandoned or rejected because of it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, yes. I
Yeah.
think so many people will hear that and just relate to you 100%, because I think that's just in our human nature to think that an argument will equal, you will break up immediately and that's it. Like, how, which makes no sense, because we've seen it in other people. We know other couples who fight, like I've seen my parents fight, you know, and it wasn't like they had a fight and then immediately everything fell apart. I think there is something to say about a healthy amount of conflict in a relationship. But yeah, that was something that I definitely experienced quite a lot in my early 20s when I was dating.
Yeah.
Um, But did your therapist give you any insight into why that's the case, why people do that?
Not like generally speaking. I think for me, a lot of it was because that's what I observed very early on and what was kind of taught to me. And so um, I just didn't learn otherwise, right? And so I always was so terrified of conflict. And like, I didn't always behave as a child, but I was, stop it. Sorry, he's calling me. I was, very good at not getting caught when I didn't follow the rules because I had a thing where like I had to, have that appearance all the time and I was terrified, like
Yeah.
terrified. It's so funny. I've never got in trouble. Maybe I shouldn't say this online, but I've never got in trouble with the police ever. But even still, whenever I like drive past one or like even walking down the street, and maybe there's like broader political reasons to be nervous around police, but like I am probably the last person to have reason to be nervous around police, and I acknowledge that fully. I still tense up and get scared. Like driving, I'll start to panic. And it's like,
But I think
why?
that's just authority. Any authority figures tend to make us feel a little bit anxious.
He has a bandage because he's picking at himself, and so that's why I'm watching him. He's really big. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember him from last time. He looks just as big and just as stark in the eyes.
Is he? He really is, isn't he? Anyway, sorry. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Like the authority thing. And I think that need for, because if you're talking back to what you kind of started with talking about, I think like that self-assuredness, and it's like that need for approval. And
Yeah.
I mean, maybe, I don't know, this is just me talking and thinking it as I go, but like police in the community are definitely a figure for like wanting maybe that approval. It's like they're the ones who you would hope enforce the laws in a good way and whatever. So maybe it is something like that. I don't know, but yeah, I definitely get nervous, and it's that I think, yeah, conflict and me. I like conflict when I can be in control, right?
Mhm.
Which goes back to that control thing of like having that assuredness in any sort of situation.
Yeah.
But conflict without a nice bow at the end is really uncomfortable, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's kind of what'll be next that I get to explore is like sometimes you have conflict without a pretty resolution. Like it just is. And like when people always say agree to disagree, that always bothered me. And maybe it relates to this. Like, who knows? I'm just unpacking my whole life story now. So yeah.
But something that's just come to my mind is it's interesting that you said, I like conflict when you feel like you have more control over the resolution, which sort of makes me think, well, is conflict where you don't feel that way necessary? Is it because I feel like when you create conflict, it's usually off the back of something that you believe in or something you feel very strongly or passionate about. And for lack of a better saying, you're trying to get the other person to
Yep.
also feel and think the same way as you. So if you're creating conflict without that kind of a resolution in mind, because I feel like regardless of the outcome, like you would still feel good and have that bow because you said how you felt.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you were to create an argument and didn't really have that as your end goal,
Mm-hmm.
were you just creating conflict for the sake of creating conflict?
I think that would be potentially the ideal because in that instance, at least the way I'm hearing it, you could exactly that be like advocating for your belief, and it's important that you communicate it, and it creates conflict. But I think the other piece of that is being okay with the fact that that person, they might like respect your choice, but they might still not agree with you in the end.
Yeah.
And so those instances are where I get definitely really uncomfortable. But I think I hold back a lot, or at least I have held back. And for me, it really comes forward of holding back who I am, not necessarily an explicit interaction, but like when the type of person I am being contradicts the type of person I know this other person values. And like thinking like father figure, right? And like father has these values and the way I'm living is different. And that creates conflict. And so it kind of comes up as an internalized fear of letting myself go down that path because it conflicts with his view of what maybe I should be and what would be accepted. So maybe like a less explicit kind of presentation of it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. It does make sense. I mean, obviously, it would be nice if you could convince everyone to think how you think, but then you were kind of erring on the side of cult leader.
A little
So,
bit. Yep. Maybe not the best idea. That's funny.
although,
So,
it does kind of seem slightly glamorous, but yeah, no, I don't really have time or patience for that.
well, there's that too, right? Except for my cat right now, because now he's on the freaking counter, so I might have to go grab him. But I did want to ask, because I know you mentioned like moving into that space where you didn't let the breakup define you. And if you're open, I would love to hear a bit about like what the process was of moving from the times where you did let that happen into the times where like it wasn't so much a factor, or maybe you let go of those thoughts and feelings a bit quicker.
It really does go back to the whole just practicing it over time with experience, because the very first breakup I went through, because it was all very new and it's the first experience, the first time, you just kind of feel like everything feels so new, and you don't know what it means or what it is, and you don't know how to process those feelings because growing up as 90s kids, all the TV shows were about happy relationships and happy families, and you met your husband that you're going to spend the rest of your life with in either high school or college, and like everything is just so great. And so you have all those expectations in the back of your head, and as time goes on and you get older, you're like, why isn't it happening? I thought that's what TV told me was going to happen. And so you don't have those skills or the tools, like you're not equipped with anything to deal with it when it happens.
So true.
Yeah. So, you've got to give yourself a little bit of a break on that and just go through the motions. And then the next time it happened, it was after a long-term relationship, and it was quite hurtful because we went to his house, like half an hour later, he decided to tell me, oh, I don't love you anymore, and then like kicked me out. And I'm just like standing on the side of the street, like, okay, what do I do now? And I'm like crying my eyes out. And my parents, who are the best, they're like, just get in a cab and we'll pay for it when you get here. And like $100 later, like I get to their house and they're consoling me, like pouring me wine, and like trying to make me feel better. But that was quite intense because in my head, I was like, this is the guy, this is the one from the TV show that I'm going to, spend the rest of my life with. And obviously in hindsight, it's like, why did I spend so much time being upset? But it's just because I had such deep feelings, and you need to give yourself time to work on that. And I've been very fortunate in my lifetime to have such a great support network, not just in my family, but in my friends too. And it's just every time it happens, you just have to take something you learned from last time into the next time. And I think eventually I just got to that point where I was like, I'm 29, I've been through this plenty of times before, and I currently feel like I'm the best version of myself I've ever been. And, just because this person doesn't want to be with me, albeit painful, like even without them in my life, I am still the same. Like I'm at that 100%, like I mentioned before, whereas I felt this person was giving me that extra 10%. And so I think that's the difference. Whereas before I was probably at like 70, 80, and then it just kind of kept building. And each time I learned something from it. And, that took conversations with people, sometimes even like getting lost in a TV show and identifying with like a strong character, and through that and seeing their interactions, although scripted, it's like it's a lesson for you. And then eventually I got to this point where I felt like I'm at 100, so it's not like I've lost any part of myself or I'm doubting any part of myself, because I know for a fact, and even he admitted it, that I am great and I gave everything and I was so understanding and always supportive. And so it's like, what else could I have done, you know? And if the other person just isn't on the same page as you, then you just kind of have to let that go. But I mean, in saying that, like, I'm not going to be dishonest with you. Like, we're still having a lot of back and forth, especially over this year, because I live in a share house, and when we were told, like, basically you have to like stay at home, I didn't want to live for my own, because being extremely extroverted, I knew it was going to have really dire consequences for my mental health. So I asked him if I could live with him, and he was like, yeah, that's fine. And so for the first couple of weeks, it was all like, everything felt back to normal. And I'm like, oh, okay, you know. But then this one evening, after many beers, we have this one conversation, and he's like, oh no, we're like, it's still as before. Like, I thought we had an understanding. And I'm like, well, here we go. This is the whole boundaries thing that needed to kick in again. But it's, you know, but that's the thing, you just got to keep trying to practice and learn from your past and just keep going. And I also want to say, you have to let yourself have bad days. You have to have those days where you make mistakes, or you cry all day, or, you know, you have a few too many red wines and then you like send a bad message. Like, it's just all part of life. It's just, you know, I feel like sometimes we get too sucked in with a lot of these self-help gurus that are out there that make you feel like there's an end destination with all of this, when really there's not. Every day is going to be a day where you're going to have a great day or a bad day. You're going to learn something an easy way or learn something a hard way. And it's funny, because there's been so many times where I've almost got sucked into these programs, like, pay $60 and, you know, you will learn what the deep core issue is within you, and then after that you will have the relationship of your dreams. And I'm like, okay, well, if it was that easy, wouldn't it be more than 60?
Yeah, you're right. It's like, wouldn't you want to take all my money because you'd get no return in
Yeah.
mind? Yeah.
They tell you the story, but they don't actually tell you how this person achieved their, you know, their desired relationship or whatnot. And there's a Facebook page where you have to request to become a member, because it's a private one.
Okay.
And on this thread, it's just women, countless women, just, I went on this date, this happened, or like, I'm in this relationship and this happened, like, help, I need advice, blah, blah, blah. And so you've got the ladies that work for this institute that respond in like a very specific way. Like, they have a, you know, a sort of dialogue that they use. And then you've got all these other women saying, oh, I think this, or I think that, or, and it feels nice because it kind of strokes your ego, because talking about your relationship just is something that makes people feel good. But I remember once reading this lady's post, and one of the mentors of this institute, you know, gave her sort of stock standard response. And a lot of it was about, you know, being the goddess that you are and coming from within. And I think really, like, I appreciate that what they mean, like in just layman's terms, is set boundaries and stick to them.
Yeah.
But they do it in this really fantastical way that's like, you're a goddess, and, you know, you, a man, like, he by nature wants to like protect you and keep you, and you have to give him space to do that, you know, all that kind of jazz.
Yeah.
And so this other girl responded off the back of that saying, you know what, I just decided one day to stop dating crappy guys, and that's what I did, and now I'm dating a good guy because I stopped dating crappy guys. It's really not that hard. And it made me laugh so much. And then when I wanted to read out the thread to a friend, I went to try and find it, and they deleted her message.
Oh, that's dirty.
Yeah. And so I felt like it's just so simple. It really is just so simple. But there's like a whole industry built around stroking our ego when it comes to these kinds of things, which feels good. But really, I think if they just said it in the layman's terms, like, set boundaries, stick to them,
It has to
then
be
you'll be
practical.
happier. Yeah, but that's not sexy. That won't sell anything. That won't make anyone any money. Like you can just get that on a keychain, I'm sure. So
No, I totally agree with you because I think I mean, in general online, I find there is a lot of that like mystical jargon.
Mhm.
But the interesting thing too is it's there, but I never see someone define their terms. Like they use these things because they're really fancy and attractive. Like you said, like it's sexy, but
Yeah.
it's like, but what do you mean by it? Like, how are you using that word? How does it feel? Like, how do I actually act that out? Um, and I find a lot of the time it doesn't really, in a pragmatic way, bring it back to that internal journey.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, like, setting the boundaries, it's like, okay, how
Yeah.
are you actually getting in touch with, like you mentioned, like those specific non-negotiables
Mhm.
that carry with you? And like, how do you figure out what those even are in the first place? And like, for me right now, it's like, okay, like, don't blame yourself for everything. But then also realizing I am currently in a place where I am like blaming myself and I am like self-deprecating to the extreme for like my entire life. So I still have to process that, right? And like, there's no mystical, magical word or thing that is going to take that process away. And
Yeah.
just like, boom, you're like in your worth and attracting this magical man on a horse. Like, no, it doesn't, it's not fucking how it goes. And that's even with me being like deep in the spiritual journey right now. Like, I'm doing that stuff day in, day out, and like channeling these messages that are super powerful and awesome. And they do help me feel more assured with where things are at, and like it's giving me an understanding and it's really giving me insight into why, um and insight, I guess, that supports me being able to let go a little bit to give him the space that he articulated that he needed and to feel okay doing that. But then there's still the practical process of how do I live out being okay doing that, and like what does this now look like for me as I move forward. um
Mhm.
yeah, so it's like that balance, I think, sometimes gets missed for sake of making it sexy and sellable.
Yeah, yeah, and that it takes a long time. I know I've repeated this, but it
Oh,
does.
please keep doing it because I'm
It
definitely in the place right now where I'm like, can I just like boom, have it done?
no,
And my therapist is like, we have to titrate this because it's trauma. And I'm going to talk to her about a couple of things. So there's some things that I feel are just not working for me. And I think it's okay to
yeah,
articulate that.
yeah,
But I'm
100%.
like, I just want to like thrash around on the floor for a month crying and like in pain and then like have it be done. And she's like, no, little bits. And like today, I haven't cried yet. And it's bothering me because I'm like, I want to keep feeling it, but it's
Mm.
not just going to be like you do the immense work every single day for a month and you're done, right?
Yeah. Well, see, and that's the other dangerous thing because sometimes feeling miserable can feel so good and it becomes addictive. And I've experienced that for sure. But what you find is eventually you realize that you've pushed people away. You've developed some unhealthy habits. For me, it was drinking, and I mean, I do like to drink, but this was like, I'd
It was
on
different.
a day off work, I'd be like, it's 10, and I feel miserable and I just want to cry and have a cigarette and listen to Lana Del Rey all day long. So that's what I did.
Yeah.
And I think I don't regret, but see, this is the other thing. Like, I don't regret that that happened because I needed to let that happen.
Mhm.
And you just learn from it every single time. So, do you know who Jocko Willink is?
No.
He's this Navy SEAL who's become famous in the self
Okay.
help space, and he's got a podcast. And the other day, I listened to a clip where he was talking about getting over a breakup. So a listener wrote in a question saying, I've just gone through this breakup, but I'm posted and I'm going to be coming home soon. And like, I don't know what's the best way to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you just need to get over it. You just need to get stuck doing the things you like to do, like if it's guitar or exercising or cooking or spending time with friends. Like, you need to just keep doing those things, and then in time you'll realize that you're fine and life is fine and it will go on and you will meet someone else new. And I was like, that's great, But I wish he just added the note in that you're going to have days where you will, start drinking red wine at 10 o'clock in the morning, listening to Lana Del Rey. But that is fine. And you need to do that because that's all a part of the healing process,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not, you don't need to beat yourself up about that. And sure, you can look back and be like, oh, all that time I spent crying and I could have been like out slaying or whatever, like people say these
That could be a
days.
keychain. Yeah.
But how did you get to that point? Because you accepted your emotions, you felt them, you rode that wave, you went through it, and you hopefully will just learn from it moving forward. I think that's the best thing you can do. Like, you accept your emotions and feel them, but this is when it's going back to doing yourself a disservice when you go into your next relationship and just repeat all the same mistakes you did last time.
For sure.
So,
My cat's such a jerk today. What would you say? Because it sounds to me, compared to where I'm currently at, that accessing those emotions maybe comes a little more naturally for you. What would you say was, if you can, like, is there anything that helped you to be able to tap into them in like a constructive way? Because I'm definitely someone where, like, I felt some stuff, oh, sweet Jesus, and then I started to really dissociate. And I think that's just from having years of things that I need to process. Like, I acknowledge that. But right now I'm kind of like, okay, I want to feel more stuff. Like, I know there's more there, but like, how to do it? Like, is there anything that you found helpful?
oh, definitely journaling, writing it down is extremely helpful. I find that finding music that helps you connect with your feelings as well, because music is an extremely emotional experience listening to it. So I found that very, very helpful a lot. That's sort of, I'd say that's my key go-to, because it's lyrics that you feel you can relate to. So it's kind of like an unofficial friend who's being there for you in that 2-3 minutes of need.
Yeah.
And then, you just kind of move on. And I find talking about it to people as well, if you're lucky, like I am, to have people who will listen to you, then that is extremely helpful, because keeping it all bottled up inside, although some people, they can, that's just how they are naturally. I think majoritively speaking, it's not healthy to lock those feelings inside, and talking about it does help, because sometimes, as you might have experienced with therapy, you might be talking about one thing, and by the end of the conversation, your therapist has guided you through your thoughts in a way where you've had some sort of revelation, and you're like, oh, I never thought of it that way, or I never realized it. I didn't know that's really how I was feeling. So I think those are 3 key things that I use, because definitely I'm all for therapy and counseling, and I think more people should do it 100%, especially when you're going through a big life change like this, because it is great to have family and friends to talk to, and you need that, and you need to do it, but it gets to a point sometimes where you need a third party who doesn't know you, doesn't know your past. All they know is what you tell them, and they make a judgment and an assessment based off of that. Whereas, of course, your friends and family are always going to be like, no, you're the best. It's their loss. Okay, which it all is. And yes, that's true. And thank you. But obviously there's like deeper issues in there that they don't have the skills or the qualifications to help you navigate, as well as a therapist or a counselor will.
Yeah. No, that definitely resonates, because I think I've had 2 things happen, and I definitely appreciate it, but it was hard for me to understand, because I think just because of my journey so far, and like for me, a big thing was getting sober and the kind of support I got as I moved through that stage of my life. What a jerk. And a big part of that initial process, when that was new, in any sort of situation where there was like resentment or sadness or fear or whatever, was looking at my part. And so it wasn't blaming me, but it was like, how can I look at my part so I can take responsibility in my like moving forward through this, right? But the thing about that was, it didn't let me sit with those darker feelings. And so I've become like too good at finding that flip side of things and moving over to it. And I noticed that with my therapist, which is something I want to mention to her more explicitly, was she very quickly will be like, well, that's distorted thinking. Like, that's not true, which is true. However, when there's these deep, for me at least, thinking like these deep, dark thoughts about myself that I've had for so long, I need to be able to sit in that longer to feel it out before jumping to that next stage, because it's so easy for me to jump to that next stage. Like, that's what's brought me to this place, is that I move from that too quickly. And so that was one thing. And then the other thing I noticed, like you're talking about with finding people who are supportive, but I think based on my experience as a upbringing with that modality, I also am not someone to get super like protective and defensive over my friends. And it's not that I like want harm done to them, but like if something happens, like I stay a little bit more objective, and I don't typically get overly emotionally charged at like in defense of them. And I noticed some friends were doing that in this situation, like for me, but it was really uncomfortable. And I think partly because it's focusing energy on something that's out of my control, right? Like I can't change what he needs and his decision and all of that. And that's part of, I think, this really grieving process in an uncoupling, is realizing like you could have done everything right, and that person might still just need to be alone right now. And it's really unfortunate timing, but it's not about you. And so it was kind of, it was leading me in a path that wasn't focused on my healing. And so I needed to be able to say, like, I know you're being supportive, but it's actually making this more difficult for me for this reason. But it was weird because I'm not like that. So at first I was like, what's going on? Why are they so angry? And also accepting that as a form of support in a way, because it's like, why are you getting so defensive over me? And I know these people care about me, but it was such a kind of, it was such a feeling, like an unfamiliar feeling, I guess is the word to use. To have that love coming towards me, even in like that way that maybe didn't feel the most supportive.
I think that's just what friends naturally do, because they will forever have your best interest at heart. And that's what friends are for, really. You know, and you want them to be supportive of you in that way. But I think this is when the whole seeking third party support is really important, because your friends are always going to just say things to your defense, which is great, but it's not really constructive after a while. You need someone to help you see things from different perspectives. And although, yes, it's sometimes can be expensive, it's definitely worthwhile the investment, in my opinion, at least.
No, I totally agree. And I think, like, I'm very new. I've had 2 sessions with this person. So that's the other thing. I mentioned these things. Like, I think I have to point this out. We're getting to know each other. So she's not going to know what supports me best. Like, she has a bunch of tools she can pull from, right? But if I'm like, this isn't sitting right, like, I need to be able to say something. But no, I think that's very true. And having that sort of, and I think in general, having an objective person you can go to who's not closely tied to a situation, also for like confidentiality's sake and out of respect to the other person involved. Because there's some things that aren't for everyone to know. And I think that's a way where you don't, and like for me, where I don't have to feel so guarded talking about it, is knowing like this won't get back to those people. Like this is a space where I can dive into these things unfiltered.
Yeah, no, definitely. And seeking counseling and therapy has just helped me so much, not only to grow as a person, but to learn how to make better decisions or identify certain behaviors. Like, you know, recently I did therapy and I discovered that I have this behavior that I do, but it's a way of dealing with feelings of anxiety when they come up, and it's something that I use to try and control it. Whereas before, I would always think like, that's just so weird. I don't understand why I do this, but I'd still do it anyway.
Yeah.
So when I finally got to the session where I felt like I want to talk about this, she was like, oh, you know, that's not so bad. But to me, it sounds like this is a way that you choose, or your mind is choosing to process your anxiety. And I thought, wow, I never thought about that in this way. And so now when I do those kinds of things, having that awareness of, okay, this isn't me being a weirdo, this is me just trying to process
Yeah.
current feelings of anxiety. It's so liberating and so nice. And so just anyone out there, please seek therapy or counseling because it will change your life for the better. But I know some people do have unfortunate experiences where they don't get along with their therapist or it just doesn't work. But like you're saying, if you're having these feelings and you want to talk to them about it, just do it because, you're paying them for a service at the end of the day.
Yeah, I feel too like with this one, I'm kind of like, I don't know if she's my forever person, but the worst case, you say something, and if they're not the one for you, and you can move on to someone else, or maybe you give the feedback, and they're actually able to take that and do things differently.
Yeah.
Or you can talk through why what they're doing is bothering you, and maybe
Yeah.
that will illuminate something else that you need to dive into together.
Yeah.
So I don't think it would ever be just like you were talking about advocating in a partnership for your things. Like, I don't think it could ever be bad to voice if something's feeling off in that relationship. But there's my lesson in the conflict thing is to be able to bring that up without being terrified of what's going to happen and just speak my mind. Because I think that's something really important to just practice doing and like exercise that muscle a little bit.
Yeah. And I think maybe having like a post conflict rundown with yourself as well, where you take the time to think about what was said by you, what was said by the other parties
Yeah.
involved. In hindsight, I would have liked to have done this or said that. And I think it's important to have those times to reflect on these conflicts too, because then next time you will feel a bit more prepared. Even if it comes out of nowhere, at least, your jerk reaction will be to say the thing that you feel is truest to you and how you really feel and what you really want to say, as opposed to just getting sort of swept up in the moment. And it's very true, taking time to breathe before responding is extremely helpful
Yeah.
as well. But let's be honest, we're human, that's not going to happen all the time. But as you have more and more conflicts and take the time to reflect off of them, the next time it happens you will feel a lot more prepared from the get-go, as opposed to feeling taken off guard. And I think, that just, I know that's something that I've experienced quite a lot over the past 2 years as well, is how to deal with conflict in a healthy way. And I've found that sleeping on it is probably the best advice I've been given, because more often than not, the next day I feel different.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, that's where like journaling or something could be a helpful way to like debrief on it with yourself and like process those things. And yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. So is there anything that because we've kind of talked through like the process and what that all looks like, but is there anything for you outside of therapy? Because of course we both are like, yeah, do that. That is a helpful kind of day-to-day tool that you continue to use to check in with yourself as you move forward in new relationships, things like that.
I don't have one singular tool or thing that I do each day or use each day, but working on myself and self-growth is something that I do each day, if that makes sense. So something I really like to do is listening to podcasts, because I feel like they give me way more insight than the news media does, and teaches me way more than the news media does. And it opens up my mind to different ways of thinking and hearing different people's opinions on current events. I find that extremely helpful. And I think sometimes that then something that they mention, I might then look into that a little bit further. So it exposes me to different things that I would have to actively sit down and try and look for myself. So I think listening to podcasts is a big one. Exercise, I think that's so, so crucial, at least for me, for my mental health. I notice if it goes 3 days and I haven't exercised, I can feel my mental health starting to deteriorate. And I've noticed, especially like when I've gone on holiday and it's been days of just drinking and going out and partying, although it's great, by the time I come home, because I haven't exercised and, I haven't been eating too healthily for quite a few days in a row, I feel that a huge shift in my mental space as
Yeah.
well. So that's probably the very key one I'd want to get across.
Mm-hmm.
But I think other things is just practicing, like building my skill sets as well, because I am very fortunate. I'm one of those people who absolutely loves their job every day, and I'm in this really cool role where I have opportunities to do new things all the time. And so through that, I'm just consistently building skills, whether it's, conversational skills or dealing with conflict or difficult people, difficult situations, chasing up this or having to talk to more, like way more senior people than me. It's always helping me build these great life skills that are transferable outside of the workplace as well. And I think taking the time as well to nurture my friendships,
Mm-hmm.
that's another big thing, because for me it's just so vital for my existence. It's like a huge part of my core existence. So I really proactively take the time to talk to them, reach out to them, make plans, see them do things as much as possible. So yeah, no, not one particular resource, but just a combination
Yeah.
of different things, really. Is there anything that you do
Oh
on
man.
a daily regular basis?
Well, definitely I would say when I was in especially like the month where I was really feeling a lot every day,
Mhm.
getting outside of my apartment was really important. I think that change of scenery, even just briefly, can be really powerful. And I was actually listening to podcasts, not like self-development podcasts. I'm listening to like this, it's a political podcast hosted by a journalist, and he interviews comedians, but so he'll like read about a person in history, and then with the comedian they'll banter back and forth. So there's some like really dark humor, but I think I needed a bit of cynicism just with what I was processing. So it's
Yeah.
like I actually laughed and would go on like 2-hour walks a day listening to this podcast. But the other thing is, some days like it was just that baseline of like, I need to make sure I eat today. And I stopped drinking coffee because I knew it would not help with my anxiety and my eating habits. So just little things like that. But in that moment, those things can take so much energy. But the walks for sure were helpful. And I think also just like you said, like nurturing relationships. But for me, I was more recently like in the like triage point where it's like you just, all your resources are going to this thing, not so much the maintenance. But reaching out to those people who were open to it and had capacity for it, even just
Mhm.
as like a daily check-in of where I was at and how I was feeling,
Mhm.
was really powerful. And like some of them would give tools, some would just kind of listen and be able to mirror for me like what I really needed. But just having people who knew what I was going through, I think was really and is really important,
Mhm.
also, so that when you're having the really bad days, it's not like you're dropping a bomb on someone if you have to reach out. And like for me, it's not like I feel
Yes. Yeah.
discouraged to reach out. It can just be like, hey, today is harder. It doesn't have to
Mhm.
be, by the way, a month and a half ago I got dumped and here's the whole thing, help me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think having like one or two people close to you who know is good, so that it's not so catastrophic and you're not replaying the whole thing if you need to reach out for help.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point, and I'm glad you said that, because there are a lot of people out there who are your friends but only reach out to you when something difficult is going on in their life and they just want to talk to someone about it, and I think obviously we both know that's not really a friendship. But it's similar to a relationship taking two to tango. A friendship takes two to tango as well, and you have to be, your open, honest self with them, because that's the only way you develop a deep connection and
Yeah.
keep it going, by letting the other person know everything about you. And I mean, even if you were the receiver, you wouldn't want someone to call you and be like, oh my gosh, here's a month and a half worth of stuff and just dump it on you.
Yeah.
Like you would want to be a part of that process with them from the beginning, finding out and going through the ups and the downs and the good days and the bad days. And I think from like a receiver's perspective as well, it can be very helpful and very educational too, you know, because sometimes hearing about other people's experiences, you learn from that as well. And you can sort of think, oh, all right, well, if this was to happen to me, like maybe I can learn from this conversation and then take that, you know, and see if I can apply it, should it ever happen to me in the future as
Totally.
well.
And that's been the interesting thing too, really, is I have a couple select people who I've been talking to, and somehow between the few of them, they have all dealt with all the aspects that I am currently going through in this one situation. And so it's just interesting to see when you start to open up, and like some of them shared these details without me even disclosing what had happened in my circumstances. And so like, it's interesting you share that, because, and it's really nice to create that connection. But then I think the other thing is realizing like, oh, hey, people can get through this. Like I'm legitimately seeing these people who have gone through these specific things, and like they're doing okay. And then I think also it's valuable, like, and I think to like my journey in recovery, like it's important to be able to share what you learn with others, just like you're doing with me right now. And like that gives them an opportunity to revisit those tools and kind of share that guidance to remind themselves of how much they've gone through. And like in time, I will be able to do that with others. And I think that's a really powerful part of just this overall journey.
Yeah, because there's I know I've been saying that you do need to have those days where you just feel the feels and, you know, drink the wine and stuff. But
Yeah.
I think conversations like these are so helpful because, yes, it is making you feel good to talk about what's going on in your life, but in a more practical way, if that makes sense. So you're kind of hitting two birds with one stone
Yeah.
because you're talking about your feelings and working through them, but not in such an indulgent way.
Mm-hmm.
But you still need to do that too. But it's good to also talk about it in a different perspective and in a different light where you can still feel like, oh, you know, it's nice to talk about this, but tomorrow or you know later today because it's already like 6:15 for me here in the evening. So it's like tomorrow when I wake up and think, okay, like how do I feel today, and I'm checking in with myself and how do I want to approach my day, you can sort of just reflect on these conversations and hopefully they'll help guide you sort of in the short term
Yeah.
things that happen, and then
Absolutely.
it sort of builds up that bank of tools and knowledge that you can keep tapping into in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. And I really appreciate, on that note, you kind of taking the time to share some of that with me, because it's oddly timely given that this was our initial, like, hey, let's talk about this thing. And we talked like a while ago. And
Yeah.
now, of course, moving forward, I'm like, hey, I'm actually in that situation. And like, I really appreciate that even with us having not obviously met before, like having you as someone who I could turn to have this conversation to help others, but also really to gain insight into what I'm experiencing. And yeah, just really appreciative of you sharing about your journey and kind of what's helped you. So thank you.
Oh, anytime. And thanks for giving me the space to do this as well, because it's been on my mind so much. Like since I booked this date in with you, it's just sort of, it's almost like I have a journal in the back of my
Yeah.
brain where I'm like writing away these different thoughts. And I feel because I am just so naturally inclined to talk about these kinds of things as well, because I'm quite passionate about the self-help space. So there's something to be said about taking time to work on yourself and be with yourself and not rush into the next thing. If it's meant to be, it's meant to be. If it happens, great. But you know, don't seek that out to make yourself feel better, because more often than not, it will just end up being detrimental. And instead of taking that time to work on yourself, you will just continue with the same behaviors you have in the past relationship, and you're still stuck at square one.
Yes, this is basically what I am currently realizing for myself. So that is a perfect summary. And yeah, I really appreciate you taking this time, and like, thank you for all of the gems that you dropped and the insights that you shared. Yeah, I just really appreciate the connection. So thank you.
Likewise, thank you so much for your time as well.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of Coffee Time. Before you leave, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And if today's show resonated, I invite you to drop into the comment section and share whatever personal introspection came up for you today. Anything you can do to help make the show more accessible is super duper appreciated. Until next time, I am your host and coffee drinking companion, Natalie, wishing you a beautifully caffeinated day.